Greetings, welcome to our lesson on running foam latex. I'm going to be taking you step by step through everything you need to do to be able to run foam. We'll also look at some foam pieces, things that can go wrong with your foam, the reasons for that, and how you can fix it. So the first stage is to make sure that we're well prepped, make sure that everything is ready, because once we get to fill the molds, we're on a time limit. As soon as you add the gelling agent into your foam mix, and we'll get to that later, but as soon as you add the gelling agent in, the timer starts. And so you've got to make sure that you're not screwing around and fumbling and look at the stuff. So we want to make sure that we're well prepared for our foam run, and I'll take you through how to prepare now. So the first step is to prepare our molds. So what I like to do is I have a table and I just basically set them all out on the table. You'll recognize a few of our old friends here that we've covered how to make different types of molds. So we'll be running these today. So the way that I like to set them up is have it so that when you go to close them, it just goes straight in like that. You've got your mold strap wood there. You've got your mold strap already in place, and then you can just tighten it down and onto the next one. You don't want to be fumbling around with your mold strap when you need to get all of these molds filled. Now, I don't think that we're going to fill every one of these molds in this run, but I like to have extra just in case. You never can tell. Sometimes you can put just the perfect amount in and there's very little waste and it goes a long way. Other times you'll sort of miscalculate and you'll have a lot of stuff in your overflow, and it wastes a little bit. So that's how I do it. I just set it up like this for pretty much all of my molds, and so that's the molds. The next is to make sure all of our stuff is clean. I've got my injection gun here. You don't need to have an injection gun. It helps because it helps prolong your foam, because it's not exposed to the air, and it helps to get it down into the bottom so you don't get as many into the bottom of molds. Like we've got one mold here which has this really deep chin, and so it's good because you can stick the nozzle of it right down in there, fill it up, and then you're not fighting to try and get foam right into the bottom. It's also good for putting it, I normally put the nozzle into the deepest part, which is usually the nose. You know, for here, I put it down in here and squirt it into here to make sure that that fills, and then fills through here. And so it helps in that regard as well, just to inject it into the lowest point, and then it fills out around it, and it helps to prevent any air bubbles. So our gun's clean. You don't need to use a gun. You can get a spatula and spatulate it into it and then work it. It takes a little bit longer, and you know, it's not quite as handy as this. I just made this myself from stuff at Home Depot, and there's a local plastic supply place where I get my tube from, so it wasn't particularly expensive. Next thing is to make sure that all of our equipment is clean. This is a fairly new mixer. I've only used it twice before, and I've had some issues with it the first time. It didn't want to spin the bowl properly. And then yesterday, when I ran foam with it, it whipped out an awful lot of ammonia, and my foam gelled, half of my run gelled in the gun. So I'm going to be adjusting for that today. It is also quite warm in here. I'll talk a little bit about how that affects it as well in a little bit. But make sure that this is all clean, wipe it all out, make sure that there's no little residue in the bottom, make sure the beaters are wiped off, make sure that all of our foam stuff is ready. We'll need some paper towel, we'll need our components. I use the castor oil for various things. It doesn't affect the foam, that's why it's good for a lubricant for the gun if you need it. I like to tint my foam, so I have some tint which puts it to a flesh tone. Stopwatch is good, some small cups that are disposable, spatulas, and a brush. Now the brush is something that I use to make sure that there's no air bubbles. So I'll put the foam in, and then I'll just kind of work it into the details. I'm not doing this. I'm not wanting to whip bubbles into it. I'm just basically just working it very, very gently into the details here. And so before you fill your mold, you're going to need to know exactly where those details are. Like for here, I know that I'm going to have to get the teeth. the teeth in around here is going to be important. All of these details here also will need a little bit of TLC. I've got one that I ran yesterday, which turned out pretty nice. That was the first run from it, but those are the chin for that Egyptian zombie piece. I know they look a little suspicious when you look at them. I didn't want to have you guys have a quick glance at that and think that was something else. So here, for example, we know that there's going to be some in here in these horns. We're going to have to really push it in there and then just kind of scooch it in before we close it and then spread it. This one here, we've got a lot of depth around this nose here. We've got the teeth here, and we've got, I just like to put it in like this and just gently work it around, make sure that it's all into the detail in the chin, and then you just kind of spread it. This one here, we've got up into the chin. So you can see that each mold has its own little nuances that you'll need to take into account. And as soon as you pour the foam in, you can't really see it. So it always helps to know your molds and to know where you need to give that little bit of attention to with your brush. But you want to make sure your brush is there ready for when you get that run. And I think that we're good to start. So let's go over some of the components and some of the bits and pieces, and then we'll get running. So let's look at our components. This is the Monster Makers brand of foam latex. This is the one that I recommend. I don't recommend GM foam anymore. I used to love GM, but ever since Gil sort of moved away from doing it, I've really not liked it, and it's just rapidly, not made me happy when I used it. So, but I do really like the Monster Makers foam. So we've got our foam latex base. The reason this doesn't have a nice little sticker is because when I get it, it comes in a 5-gallon pail. Now, little tip, when you are filling an extra bottle from this, I don't ever try and fill the thing out of this because it's just too heavy and awkward, and when you're trying to get really, gram for gram increments, it becomes, a little unpredictable, fighting a large bucket. So if you want to fill something like this is already full, but turn it on its side like this with a nozzle on the top. Open it up, and then as you roll it, your surface might be here, okay? And then as you turn it, all of a sudden it'll start coming out the nozzle here, and you'll be able to hold your bottle underneath it, and that way you're not monkeying around with a really heavy bucket. And then as it gets more and more empty, you'll just spin it, and you can see how the nozzle's going down, and it just allows air. You don't want to have it so that it's fighting to have airflow come back in to replace the previous foam latex liquid. Otherwise, then you get a blub 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 blub, and it'll cause you to miss the nozzle of your bottle. So always make sure that there's sort of half your nozzle is empty on the top, so that it can flow predictably and easily into whatever receiver you're putting it into. Before you do that, though, you have to make sure that you shake it up really, really, really well. What happens is any kind of latex, when it's kept in its liquid form, what keeps it in its liquid form is called ammonia, and all the ammonia likes to settle at the top, and then all of your latex base is in the bottom. So if you don't shake it up well, you're going to end up pouring a lot of ammonia in, and it's going to delay your gelling time, and then the stuff at the bottom is going to gel really, really fast because there's no ammonia in there, or not as much ammonia. So you want to make sure that you shake it really, really well, disperse that ammonia through the whole thing before you pour it into something else, and then every time you use it, shake it up really well as well. That way it's predictable. You can kind of count on your gelling time and all of that type of thing. So the foam latex base is basically the only part that has latex in it, and it's not just liquid latex. You can't just grab liquid latex off the shelf and throw it in with some components. This is like pH balance, and it's got some extra stuff in there so that it works in the system with the foam latex system. So that's your foam latex base. we've got our foaming agent, which is effectively just soap. That's what allows us to get our rise. So it's making latex suds. So that's what that is. This is the curing agent. If you look at foam latex that hasn't cured, let me see if I've got some here. Okay, so if you look at this and you squeeze it, see how it stays, that dent stays there? Okay, that means it's not cured, it's uncured. So that basically makes the prosthetic worthless. Once you demold it, it gets all jacked up and is unusable. It destroys the sculpt. So the curing agent is what gives it its rebound memory. So when you have your prosthetic and you do that, see how it springs right back? That's what you want with your foam latex. Obviously, if there's any kind of delay, like if you press it and then it slowly comes back up, it means it hasn't been cured enough. So the curing agent is what gives it its rebound memory, and it is actually activated by heat. That's why we bake our foam latex, is to activate the curing agent and to give it its rebound memory. The gelling agent. This is what takes our mix and makes it go solid. So they're the four components. 3 of these get mixed at the beginning, 1 of them gets added at the end. If you look at typically the colors, typically with both of the GM foam systems and the Monster Makers, the gelling agent is much darker. So that is a visual cue that it doesn't get added at the same time. There's a visual difference between those components. So the one that's darker, we'll just pop to the side because that gets added when we've finished our different stages of foam and we want to finish up and gel it and fill our molds. We're also going to need a scale with single gram increments. A lot of people like using a triple beam scale. It is a little bit more accurate. This one here is actually 2 grams, 2 gram increments, which means that I could always be at any time 1.5 grams off. I've found that it doesn't really affect the foam that much. Some people are really finicky about that. I've found that it's a little more forgiving than that, so that's fine as well. So this is probably about as good a time as any to interject before we get into actually running the foam and talk a little bit about something that we haven't discussed in this particular tutorial, and that is mold release. The reason that we haven't discussed it is all of the molds that we were running in this are all made out of either 1630 or an epoxy syntactic dough system, neither of which actually need mold release when you're running foam. It's one of the benefits of those products is you don't need to worry about releasing it. It just is inherent in the properties of that particular material. More than likely though, when you're starting out, you're going to be making most of your molds out of this stuff, which is called UltraCal. And this is a gypsum cement. I'll be doing some tutorials on UltraCal coming up soon. But one of the problems, there are many positive things to UltraCal. It's cheap. It gives, in my opinion, the best foam comes out of UltraCal molds because of the fact that it is a porous material and it does absorb some of the moisture. That brings with it inherent problems such as needing a mold release. So there are a few different options that you can choose. I know some people who just like to sprinkle in baby powder and then just brush it out, and that's all the mold release that they use for UltraCal molds. And I've had some success with that when I've run out of other mold releases. My first choice is this stuff here, our old friend, Ease Release 200. This actually works really, really well for foam latex in UltraCal molds. I had a lot of success with it. I like it a lot. When you buy your foam latex kit, you'll come with some of this stuff, which is mold release. Now this particular mold release is much the same as what you get in GM. It's a steric acid base, comes in like a paste, kind of like a paste, and you basically just dip in and then just brush it in. and it should go in kind of clear, kind of pearlescent. And then you're going to have to wait until it turns white. It's going to turn like very, very strong white, and then you need to buff it out with either a cut down chip brush or a rag, and it really slows the production down. So I tend to not like using this particular mold release for that reason alone. But the main reason I don't like this is because it's a stearic acid base. It actually, over time, will eat away the surface of your mold. So if you're making a mold that you need a lot of runs out of, I would probably avoid this particular mold release and go with one of the other two that we mentioned. So that's mold releases. This one here, I just basically spray some release in, like so. Now that's ready to run. It's fast, it works well, it doesn't destroy the surface of your mold. If you look at this one at the back here, now I've run this particular mold, this one here, probably 6 times only, which isn't very many times considering some of my other production molds I've run upwards of 200-300 times. And you can see that the surface of the mold is starting to kind of deteriorate from the foam latex. And it will just get worse and worse and worse, and then it will start to just crumble off. The surface will crumble off, and then it'll be unusable. The quality will be so poor. So that's part of the problem with UltraCal, is that it is quite low quality when it comes to multiple runs. If you have to do more than, say, 20 or 30 runs, I would steer clear of UltraCal. If you're doing something just for a one-off, or you're only shooting for a week and they only need a dozen pieces, then yeah, absolutely go with UltraCal. It's cheap, gives you great foam, and we'll talk more about the properties of UltraCal in the UltraCal video. But that's mold releases. Now back on with our running of foam. Alright, so let's get this run. So what I'm going to do is when I start it, I'm going to leave this running in the background and make sure that you can see the timer. You always want to time your foam runs just so that things are predictable. The things you need to bear in mind in the space that you're running it in, because every space will be different, is your temperature and your humidity in the room. The temperature, if it's warm, it means that it'll evaporate the ammonia out of your mix faster, so it will gel faster. The ammonia, the higher the amount of ammonia left in your mix, the slower it will gel. So depending on a few things will depend on how much ammonia you're left with. Typically it's the temperature in the room and how long you whip your foam for, because as you're doing that, then it'll beat out the ammonia from the mix. And so you'll need to bear that in mind when you're figuring out how much gelling agent. Yesterday I did 30 grams of gelling. Today I'm going to do 20 just to give me a little extra work time. You really want your gel time to be right around 10 minutes. If it's way longer than 10 minutes, then when you wash your dishes and you have your soap suds come up and then they start popping, eventually they'll disappear. It's the same with your foam latex, and if it doesn't gel before that happens, then you'll end up with tiny little holes called pinholes in your surface of your foam, which you don't want, because when you put your makeup on, it ends up looking like little black dots and it looks horrible. So most people will be upset with you if you give that to them to apply on set. So we want to kind of gauge that. Sometimes when you're running in a new space, you're going to end up wasting half a batch because it may kick too soon, or it may kick too long, and then you'll have to adjust it. So every time I run for the first time in a new environment, or if I walk in here and it's right in the middle of summer, the air conditioning maybe isn't working as well as it could, then we need to make sure that we adjust for that. So I'm going to be putting 500 grams of base today. This is a nice big bowl. I just bought this Beta a couple of days ago, this mixer. It's a Sunbeam Mixmaster, which is my favorite brand to use, and they've got a nice big bowl. So normally with the old Sunbeam Mixmasters, you would do a double batch, or a single batch would be 150 grams. And if you notice on the bottle, it's always given the measurements here, use 15 grams per 150 grams. And it's the same with GM. It's 150 grams is their standard single batch. And then, if you do a double batch, it could be 300. Most of the time with the old style Sunbeam Mixmasters, the double batch people would consider to be 375. I always did just 300 or 400. So, but with these big bowls, what happens is it gets too low in the bowl, and these can't get any kind of teeth into it to whip it up. So you end up whipping it up for ages and whip out too much ammonia. It becomes kind of finicky. So I just do a 500 gram batch as my double batch here, and that gives me a nice full amount, and I can fill a lot of molds with that. So just make sure that we mix it up really, really well. And put that to 500. Okay, that went just a tiny bit over, so I'm just going to scoop out. Now obviously, that's perfect, that's 500 exactly. Once we start mixing other elements into it, you can't do that. That's only for the base, when it's the only thing in there. Otherwise, it becomes contaminated with other bits and pieces. Okay, our gelling agent we're going to deal with later. It doesn't matter which of these you put in first, it all gets mixed in together. So the curing agent is 15 grams per 150, so it's 10%. Of whatever you put in here, it's 10% is your curing agent. So obviously that is going to be 50. So go ahead and put in 50 of this. Okay. And then our foaming agent is 30 grams per 150. So it's 20%. So that will be 100. So just add in 100 of this, and you always make sure you stir up your components really, really well before you add them in, because they do like to separate, especially the curing agent. So 100. As I said, I like to throw some mix in, some pigment in. Okay, so that's now ready to run, and we'll go ahead and tear that off, and I'm going to put 20 grams of gelling. I think that should help, because I think 30 was too slow. Okay, 20. And I really, really whipped it a lot. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it out of the way. If I leave it here, the danger, this likes to spit little bits of latex. If you look at the back, you can see there's all kinds of spattery bits of latex. You don't want this latex going into here, and then it'll gel those little dots, and then when you add it in, you'll get little hard balls of latex in your mix, which will ruin your foam. So you want to keep this well and truly out of the way, where there is no way that it can get affected by the spitting of this. I'm going to go ahead and pop this scale out of the way as well, because we're done with it for now, and I don't want it getting in the way. Okay. We've got basically four stages to our foam run. The first is just mixing it. We mix it for about 30 seconds just to make sure that everything is distributed evenly through the mix. And Oh, when you buy your mixer, some Sunbeam Mixmasters have a motorized base. You don't want those. You want to be able to back bowl it like this by hand. So that's an important thing to remember too. Make sure you got one that you can back bowl, because there are some times where that's the only reason that you can get certain parts of it, because it'll just sort of spin in the middle here. I'll show you that as we're running it. There's 4 things. First is the mixing, just the basic mixing. Because we put the pigment in, when the pigment is evenly through the whole thing, then we know that everything is distributed evenly. So it's a good indicator of that as well. You can run the foam without any pigment. It just becomes white. But I like to do it with the flesh tone, just in case the foam splits or something, and then it makes it less noticeable. The second stage is the whipping. So that's where we get our rise. Now, the higher the rise, the softer our foam will be, because we're taking that same amount and we're spreading it over a larger amount of volume. So if you're doing something like horns or ears or something, you want it to be fairly dense. So you would maybe whip it up just a little bit. If you're wanting something very, very soft, then you whip it all the way up. I don't like taking it any higher on the beaters than about here, right before it starts curving up and in. You certainly don't want to have it going over the top of the beaters, because then when you add your gelling agent, it's possible that it's not going to reach some parts and it becomes unmanageable with trying to get rid of the bubbles. So that's your whipping phase. Then we have our mid-range refining, and then we have our ultra refining, and then we add our gelling. So that's part of the refining process. So let's get this going. So we'll put that in. We'll start this, and we're just going to put it onto 2 at first. And we'll start our stopwatch. And I'm just going to take my spatula, and I'm just going to kind of just sort of make sure it gets all mixed together and scrape it the side. So you can see that's all nicely the one color now. And we do that for 30 seconds. Then we crank it up on a high. Now if I was doing this with maybe a small bowl, I would only put it to about an 8, because the beaters take up so much more room in the bowl. They take up like a third of the bowl, as opposed to maybe an 1/8 of the bowl here. So more of it gets whipped faster, and it whips up really, really fast. And if you whip it up too fast, you're not going to whip enough ammonia out of it, and it's going to cause problems with your gelling later. You know, and from time to time, I just like to do a little bit of a back bowl. Now, our next time that we need to pay attention to is 8 minutes. 8 minutes is where we put it down to our ultra refining. So if we can get the volume that we need prior to 8 minutes, then we put it down on like a 5 for our mid-refining. If it takes a full 8 minutes to get our rise, which I know it won't today, sometimes it does, depending if it's a really cold room, really dry, then it takes quite a while. Humidity in the room will actually help with your rise. The more humid it is, the faster it rises. I don't know why, that just seems to be the case. So if we put it down to 5, the reason that we do that, instead of just putting it straight down to 2, is that we still need to whip out ammonia, and 2 doesn't whip out as much ammonia as 5, so putting it on 5 isn't going to really whip up more rise. So once we've got the rise that we want, which I like to have right around here, you know, just below where it starts curving up, then you don't want to add more. So you put down to 5, and it'll just kind of keep it right where it is, and that way we can just whip out some more ammonia. Although in this room it's quite warm in here, I don't think that's going to be a problem. So with some of my older mixers, I've had to really backbowling it. Backbowling it puts it backwards through the mixers and whips it up faster. So sometimes you'll need to do that just to get your rise up. With this one I've noticed it doesn't really need it. It whips up pretty well just by running it, which has been great. These ones here you can buy from Walmart for like 60 bucks. They're pretty cheap. All my other ones I used to buy on eBay or local trading post sites for you know, second-hand mixers, but I always ran into problems with the turntable crapping out because they've been used so much. So you can see that's starting to get some decent volume to it. We're about halfway up the beaters by now. So you'll notice if you look down into it that these bubbles here, they just kind of spin into one spot. They never go back through they never really go back through the beaters. So when we back bowl, we force them through the beaters again. So that's part of the reason why we have to be able to back bowl as well. Otherwise they would just spin there, spin there, spin there. And when we add our gelling agent, it'll just sit and spin and gel that into a solid lump. And we'll end up with a big goober in our foam, which is always crappy. It gives you crappy foam. So you can see we're right at almost at 4.5 minutes and we've almost reached our desired rise. You also need to bear in mind that at the moment that's whipping a lot of air in, so it's lifting the surface of the foam a lot. When we turn it down, you'll notice that the level will drop about this much in the bowl. So you want to bear that in mind as well when you're kind of figuring out what's the rise that you want. Obviously, also, the more that you whip it up, the less, the more viscous the mix will become, and so then it doesn't flow over your mold as well. So it makes it a little trickier to avoid air bubbles in your foam. So I always like to keep it just a little bit runny. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and just say that that's right about the volume that I want. So I'm just going to turn it down to 5. And you can see how that's kind of dropped down a little bit with the volume, you know, where it sits on the beater. And then, you know, I'll just do a little bit of back bowling to make sure that all of the bubbles get in, so that that one little bit that keeps circling there doesn't just stay and not get put through the mixer, through the beaters. So just every little once in a while I'll just do that. Now you can see that the bubbles are decidedly smaller now than they were when we were whipping it, which makes a lot of sense. We're not whipping the heck out of it anymore. We're trying to start refining it down. Every bubble is going to be a hole in your foam, be it inside the structure of the prosthetic, maybe on your blending edge, maybe on your surface, and you want to try and make sure that there's very little, if any. Preferably you want no bubbles at all in it, so you want a very smooth foam mix. Okay, we're at almost at 7 minutes. And you should, by this point, notice a distinctly strong decline in the aroma of the foam. When you first start whipping it up, it's like just someone's kicked you in the back of the throat and the nose. It's super strong, very pungent ammonia smell. But by the time you get to this, you definitely want to have a little bit of it there because you don't want it to gel before you're ready. But you should have a very steep decrease in how smelly it is. And if you find that it's just too strong, sometimes I'll take a box fan and I'll just sit it behind it and just blow it, and it just blows the ammonia away, and you don't even smell it at all. Okay, we're almost at 8 minutes, so I'm going to pop it down to 2. And this should start the ultra refining process. And we'll grab our gelling agent and get it ready now. Now when I go to fill my mold, you're going to have to follow me, so it's going to get not quite as steady as it is now, because it's not going to be on the tripod anymore. So now the next number we're looking for is 10.5 minutes, is when we add our gelling. And you can see that line that the beaters is making, I add it right on that line there, so it goes right through the middle of the beaters. And as I was saying earlier, as soon as we add our gelling agent, we're on the clock. So, another thing to pay attention to is if you look at the edge here, you'll see that from the surface line, there's a slightly dark spot on the side of the bowl. You want to avoid scraping that at all costs, because that's already started to set, and if you put that in, it's going to put big areas of semi-dry latex through it, and it's going to ruin your blending edge. It's going to ruin your prosthetic. It's not going to move well, and it's not going to blend well. It's just going to be horrible. So you always want to avoid, when you're scraping your bowl out, scrape it up to that line, and then that's it. Now when it comes to filling my injection gun, I'm going to do what's called a high pour, which means that the stream is going to be very, very thin, and that helps just get rid of any other remaining air bubbles, because the surface is a larger percentage, the surface area is a larger percentage of the stream than if we just pour it in. And so any that are right in the middle, here we go, 10:30. And it takes about 15 seconds. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And then you want to back bowl it. And I like to just scrape the sides here without scraping that top nasty area. And then I sort of bring it along the bottom to make sure that there's no stuff on the bottom that's got a big lump of gelling agent, and then I let it go forward for 30 seconds. Oops, we've got some small little bubbles there. I want to make sure we get those. Okay, turn it off, lift this up. Okay. We go here and we do what's called our high pour. So you can see that it's got a very thin stream. And then when it comes to scrape out the bowl, I'm not going to scrape through here, because I don't want to get any of that just kind of scooching it out very gently, so I'm not actually scraping it like this and picking up any of that nastiness. Then if you're going to use an injection gun, then you want to make sure you get any of the air out before you start injecting it. So you want to actually see it come out the end. Okay, there we go. So let's fill the mold. So run around here, I just want you to close up on what I'm doing. So get in as close as you can. So I put that in there and I'm just filling this. Okay. And practice will give you how much to use. I'm just going to fill a few of these and then I'll come back and do some more. All right, so we've got our brush and I'm just going to gently, as I said, you don't want to whip air bubbles in, you just want to work it gently into the surface of your mold. If you see any little air bubbles come up, just get rid of them. And then I'm just going to just very, very gently just sort of guide it up into the area of the sculpt there. Pop this in. And you want to see a little bit ooze out all the way around, which is nice. It means that we've filled the whole thing. Pop this down. Crank it down. That one's done. And we move on to the next one. We're working this into all of that fine detail. Yeah, you don't want to be whipping a whole bunch of air into your piece. Make sure we get the teeth. And then sort of gently spread it. Now normally I would use a 2-inch chip brush for this because it covers more surface, but because I have that one Egyptian one with the big chin, I can't get a 2-inch brush down in there. So, and you can look down in here and you can see that there's foam that's all the way around. What sucks is when you do it and it just oozes out and it's all coming over the top and you know that you screwed up with your amount you put in because you wasted all of that. Sometimes I'll take some of that and I'll scrape it off and fill another mold with it, but it's never quite the same. You get some air bubbles and stuff. So right now I'm working into those little horns. If you push the mold down with your strap wood, you don't get as much foam latex on your hand, so it's not quite as unpleasant. It's done. This one here has a lot of detail, a lot of wrinkly detail, so we want to make sure that we get it into all of that surface around the nose. You want to hear that nice snap when you do your thing as well. That one. We got that one. That one. Now it does solidify much faster once you expose it to the air. The air will start to put like a surface skin on your foam, which is why I try to leave as much in the injection gun as possible. Plus you don't want to be picking it up, filling one mold, picking it up, filling one mold, picking it up, filling one mold. That will slow you down. So I try to do like 4 or 5 at a time. And get into that lip and the cheeks. This one we don't need the brow, I only need the chin, so that's why I didn't fill the brow. Okay. Make sure you're wearing old clothes that you don't care about when you're doing any of this stuff, because most of this stuff will ruin your clothing. Okay, we've only got a little bit left, so do this one. Or maybe I'll get this one. Yep, and I think we're done. We are out. So we did a pretty good run. We got quite a few molds in. And that's because if you look back over these, there's really not much wastage. There's a little bit on this one, but that's not bad. Alright, so our molds are all gelled. You can push your finger down and it stays down, obviously, but you can feel that resistance. So we're good to put these in the oven now. Now, when handling your molds, if you've strapped them in the way that we've strapped this today, then the best way is for you to pick it up by the mold strap wood, and then that's not going to mess up your mold. If it didn't have the mold strap, you can only handle it by the bottom mold. If you handle it by the top, you run the risk of shifting it and possibly lifting it and crunching it. So you want to just only ever handle it by the bottom, unless you've strapped it and it's not going anywhere. It's very, very secure, and you just pick it up by the mold strap, and you can basically put it wherever you want in the oven. So I'm gonna load these in. Okay. Close that up, and then just put this over to 6. And this will bake, this oven will bake for 6 hours. I usually bake around 130 to 135 degrees, which is on the low end, but it prevents steam leaks. If you bake too high, you run the risk of steam leaks, and then it's a waste of your time. But you can, if you do bake it high, you can bake it for just 2 or 3 hours, but the lower you bake it, the longer you have to bake it for. So I normally do about 135 for about 6 to 7 hours. And I guess we'll come back when they're all baked, and I'll show you how to demold. All right, so let's have a look at some pieces that have issues with them and why. So if you look at this piece here, you'll be able to see that here there's like this hard sort of bits of rubber through. Now what that is That is what happens when you don't mix your gelling agent thoroughly enough. And there's a section, remember we were talking about, there's a section sometimes on the bottom and it'll gel into like a goober and then go through. Well, that's kind of what happens, is it makes a very hard rubber kind of piece and kind of messes up the piece. Okay, if you look at the surface here, you'll see some tiny little holes. They're pinholes, and they are caused either by it taking too long to gel or not refining it long enough. Now if we flip this, if you look down here, there's that weird little, it looks compressed, and if you look on the back, we've got a whole bunch of that, a whole bunch of stuff that looks like someone's just kind of pressed it in. That's called a steam lake. What happens is that steam will build up inside the mold and there's nowhere for it to go. And so as it expands, it compresses the foam, which is not yet cured. And so it causes these steam lakes, which will ruin the piece. And then these here are voids. There's a couple of spots here where we didn't get quite enough foam in the mold. So not fantastic. Okay, this is Shrek. So if we look at the back here, you can see there was an itty bitty little steam lake starting, but you can see what's left of that vent hole bit. It obviously escaped. So this could be usable because it's on a bit that's quite thick, so it's not going to affect anything. But if you look here, this edge is, well, it's a blending ledge. It's very, very high. You're not going to get that blended in without having a lot of stuff scooched in there to blend that edge off. Now, what causes this kind of bad edge? Well, it means that the core wasn't pressed up against the mold properly. Either I didn't strap it hard enough, or it was seated slightly off. But that's pretty much worthless. Here's another Shrek. You can see that this edge is much nicer. It's got a much more of that membrane-like edge on it, so it'll blend in nicely, but it does have quite a bad steam lake on the bottom, and then more steam laking in the back. Okay, this Grinch. All right, firstly it tore getting out, so it was wasted for that. But if you look at it, you will see that there's a weird sort of line here that sort of extends all the way around here. What that is a pour line. So we poured it into the mold, and I took too long. I poured too many molds, and this started to gel. And then when I squished it, it kind of jumped over here. And so that was the line of the foam where I first poured it, and that's why that's like that. Which, you know. Okay, this one here, if you look in the back, you'll see that the surface is kind of separated from the prosthetic. This is called delamination. Typically, this occurs if you run foam in an ultracal mold that hasn't been sufficiently baked out. So there's still moisture in it, and so it causes this delamination. Delamination can also occur if the mold isn't gelled, or it's just starting to gel, and you kind of jiggle the mold around and it moves, and so the stuff that was gelled on the surface is slightly separated from the stuff that's inside. Okay, this fella's a beast from Beauty and the Beast. It tore getting it out, but if you turn it over, we have, this is called spider egg, and it's pretty nasty. It's like a total surface. You can get way worse than that, where it just looks just horrible. But it's a total structural failure to the foam. And what happens, what causes this is if you bake your foam before it's gelled, it does really nasty things to it. This one here has a big void right in here. You can see that there's a big area here that has a big kind of bubble there. That's just carelessness in filling it. Or if I close my mold too hard, maybe it squirted it up out of there and nothing went in to fill it. So we have effectively a big air bubble in there, which renders it worthless. This one here, see there's a pour line on it all the way around. There's quite a few pinholes and a bit of a steam laking along the bottom, and the blending edge is utter garbage. Really hard, sort of hard latex. It should just break away really easily and be should be kind of like this really kind of membrane edge, and it's not. It's just this nasty hard rubber. So this was pretty much a total failure of a piece. But what causes this blending edge to do this is if your foam's gelling when you close the mold, and the cutting edge compresses slightly gelled foam, and it doesn't cut through it. It just smushes it into a hard rubber surface, and so that's what causes that. So that's pretty much everything that can go wrong with your foam, and how to fix it, how to avoid it, what causes it. And if you've got any questions about stuff, pop them in the comments below, and I'll answer them as soon as I can. It's all baked, and we're just getting ready to demold it. So one thing that you really always should try and do is to open your molds while they're still warm. It releases the foam much more easily. Okay, so the foam's in there. I always kind of check it with my finger to make sure that it's all fully cured and there's no little indents coming. Sprinkle in some powder. What the powder does is it prevents it from sticking to itself as we're demolding it. Never rub the thing because you can ruin your blending edge. So I just kind of pat it, and then you just kind of carefully. Now you're going to see in here that part of it is wanting to tear away from the flashing. So we want to try and keep the flashing attached as much as possible. And you've got to be very careful. And if something kind of feels like it's going to catch, then you just kind of work it out with your fingers, because you don't want to rip your prosthetic after all the work you put in. Now you'll find that some will want to attach to the negative, some will want to attach to the positive, and others will be sort of attached to both. If you find one that's attached to both, you got to work your hand in and figure which way you want to do it, and then either separate it from here or separate it from there. The last thing you want is to tear your prosthetic. And you want to take your time with this. It's not worth rushing it just to save, 10, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever. After you've been baking it for hours and running it and doing all of that, you want to make sure that you take your time, make sure that you've got everything. Okay, so there's our sugar skull prosthetic. I just sort of shove it there. And you'll notice that when I'm demolding it, I'm basically setting it up for the next one. So I open it, put that down there, put the mold strap there, pull out the core, sit it there. Now it's all set up like it was when we ran our foam. So that's fine. You're going to be tempted to blow on it to get rid of the powder. Don't do that, it's a little unhygienic, especially since it's going against someone's face. You can always kind of shake it off later. Now you'll notice the best blending edges are where, when you pull it off, there's just nothing attached. Like there's no way that it can attach. You can see how that's already in two pieces. So we know that that blending edge is going to be nice. It's not going to be thick, and it's going to work nicely. Okay, and there's that one. So I'll just sit that on here. There we go. Grab another one. I know some people who'll get a sock and they'll fill it with powder and they'll just go whomp and hit it with that. I've never tried that, but if you're looking for something kind of different to try, that might be an option for you. This is our tri-horn brow that we made the mold of together, if you remember rightly, during one of our tutorials on working with 1630. And here's that one. You can see again the blending edge is barely holding on, which is perfect. Means it's going to be a nice blending edge. And then just make sure that you go over your mold and any bits and pieces that are attached to the mold, that you rub that off before running it again. And then you need to allow your molds to cool down. If you run foam in a mold that's too warm, it can cause delamination, and we don't want that. I know that we looked at those in when we were looking at all of our different things that can go wrong with foam, and I forgot to mention that in the delamination section where the skin was kind of separating. Running it in a warm mold will do that as well. That's because the skin, the warmth from the mold will set the skin before the rest of it is set chemically, and it causes problems that way. So that's how you demold a mold. I know one that always attaches to the positive. Let's do that one. So, yeah. This one I always have issues with because it wants to stay on the positive, and maybe it'll split between the two. Just like, okay, you can see there how half of it is wanting to come up on this and half of it's wanting to stay. So I'm looking at that. I'm assuming most of it's going to be on the face, so I'll just get in and carefully make sure that that is all. There we go. So there we have that. And so now we'll just get that a powder. And we'll just carefully remove that from the positive. And then there's bits and pieces in here that we'll need to make sure that we pull out as well. And that's running foam. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments below and I'll answer them as best I can. Thanks.